Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute. My name is Laura Shepard, and I'm the Director of Events. And we're very pleased to welcome you for our book event with J.J. Mulligan Sepúlveda for his new book, No Human is Illegal, an attorney on the front lines of the immigration war, in conversation with attorney Holly Cooper. Both are at the UC Davis Immigration Law Clinic. And so tonight, we would like to welcome the students and staff of the Immigration Law Clinic. If it's the first time that you're here, we're very pleased to welcome you. Also, we will give you a tour of our incredible library after the program. We also would like to welcome our friends and associates from co-sponsors, the California Historical Society and Refugee Transitions. And Refugee Transitions has their office just down on Market Street, very close by. The information, if you'd like to sign up on their mailing list, it's on the side over here. I'm sure they will be welcoming your volunteerism and also your interest in the work that they do as well here in San Francisco. So before we begin, how many are absolutely new to the Mechanics Institute? Who's never been here before? Many, okay, wonderful. So tonight I'm going to give a tour afterwards. We could also come back on a Wednesday at noon, take the free tour of our incredible library, and find out about our history. We began in 1854, so we have a long history. Down the hall is the International Chess Club. The library, which is a general interest library, is on the second and third floors. We have ongoing author events like this one, our Cinemalit film series, which is every Friday night. We have book clubs, Proust group, writers groups, chess classes, chess tournaments. All is going on 7 days a week under one roof. So we encourage people to take the tour, become a member, and find out more about our cultural resources here under one roof. So, today, with a 34-day government shutdown, we are literally up against the wall, or a wall, or the wall, some wall. To have or not to have the wall is the question of the day. With no resolution to reforms for immigration, law, and human rights and civil rights, this book has come at the perfect time. So I would like to introduce our guests. J.J. Mulligan Sepúlveda is an immigration lawyer, currently at UC Davis School of Law in the Immigration Law Clinic, which we mentioned before. He is a former Immigrant Justice Corps Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar, and this is his first book. He has firsthand experience, both personal and professional, assisting immigrants at the borders, airports, and in the court. Holly Cooper is the co-director of the Immigration Law Clinic. Yay. She has extensive litigation experience defending the rights of immigrants and is a nationally recognized expert on immigration detention issues and on the immigration consequences of criminal convictions. In the Immigration Law Clinic, she focuses on advocating for the rights of detained immigrants, and she also served as a senior staff attorney at the Flores Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. We are so pleased to welcome them for the first time to Mechanics Institute to talk about their own experiences, also what's happening on the ground here in California, and to illuminate this crisis of our day. So please welcome J.J. Mulligan Sepúlveda and Holly Cooper. And books will be on sale after the program.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me through this microphone? That's a new thing. Did you turn it on? Mute? Up here.
Sorry.
You got her too?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. All right, well, I just want to start by thanking everyone for being here. I'm just in awe of this turnout. It's like students who are going to be the future advocates, old friends, new friends, family, my lovely daughter Chloe here in the front. And thank you so much to Holly Cooper, who's been a mentor to me and is just a legendary immigration lawyer. Having her here is really, really special. So thank you to everyone. Before we get started, we're going to try and have some fun. This is a really dark and serious topic, but hopefully we can keep it light tonight as well. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so we'll try and get through our own questions in our conversation, because we would much rather hear from you than have you just hear from us the whole time. So with that, I think we'll get going. Do you want to start? Should I start?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. Well, I think my first question is how we keep a sense of humor in this area of the law, because it's so serious and it's so rough right now. And in the book, I've really tried to not take myself too seriously, even though there's some very tragic events going on. I don't want it to think like I'm some savior or anything like this, despite what the editor put on the subtitle, right? This is a book about all the work that we do as immigration advocates and what's going on in current events, but I don't want it to think like I have all the answers or anything like that. So I guess I want to start off by saying, how do we, keep a sense of humor in this area of work? Because I think that's the best way to survive.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a survival mechanism, but I also think that it's important to have a sense of humor because I think oftentimes most of our clients, about 80% of them are children who are detained by immigration. And so it's not only just keeping a sense of humor within ourselves, but being able to explore the beauty of the human being that's in front of you. And I think using humor as a tool to reach children oftentimes allows them to open up and tell you about their own stories. And I think so often the children, sometimes will end up, laughing in the interview about, different aspects of their case, even though it's very serious. The migration, I can't, I don't want to undersell how serious the situation is for their confinement and their migration, but also there's in each child, there's such a beautiful human spirit of survival. Yeah. And a lot of times they also use humor as a survival mechanism.
Yeah, and I think us as advocates too, when we're talking amongst ourselves, there's such immense absurdities in this area of law that if you take it too seriously, you'll just drive yourself insane. And I think the fact that we work in that same area and we can share some stories, and we always joke that we're going to write a sitcom about immigration lawyers in nonprofit law, because every day seems like a new episode. Some quirk, some incredible thing is happening in front of some judge or with something that the Trump administration does. It just seems so surreal that you have to laugh about it. And I think that's the only way sometimes to go forward with our days.
So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book, and give us a little brief overview of what it's about.
Right. Well, this book is extremely personal because it's something I wrote as my story and my family's story and the work I was doing. But then I wanted to make it something that's a story of all of us as advocates and the immigration law system and what that's like, because I think there's a lot of talking about either building a wall or everyone thinks everyone on the left just wants open borders, right? And there's nothing in between. And so to show just what it's like working in immigration law for all of us and to see what we go through, I think was sort of how I structured the book a little bit. But I started writing it, and this is something I want to talk to you about. But I started writing it because my wife, who's here, Alejandra, or she was here. She's probably making her.
The newborn baby. No
yeah, she's a psychologist, and a lot of the stuff we take in from our clients leads to something that I like to call vicarious trauma, and it's you're taking in these really horrific stories, and you're having to sift through them to find how somebody qualifies for immigration law. And that can really stick with you. When you're writing declarations about their lives, you're writing in the I, in the first person. And that's something that makes it very difficult to go forward. It's never as difficult as what our clients go through, but it's also difficult to live your life in that way. And so my wife said that not writing this book, but keeping a journal so that I could understand what we were going through and what was happening to the people that I knew after the Trump election and after all these things would help me get a perspective on things. And so there was never an idea about writing a book. It was more of just dealing with what was going on in my mind and what I was seeing every day. And then at some point I had like 300 pages, and it was just like a rant, right? It was just like, you know, when you take those paper bags and you just yell into a paper bag. I had 300 pages of that. And so I sent it to an editor, and this incredible editor at Melville House, which is an independent publisher in New York and London, saw something in there, and it became this book, and it developed a structure that I didn't know it had. And so I was really, really happy to work with it, and I'm really proud of the book, though I'm terrified of writing my first book, but I'm really proud of it as well. And so how do you feel like, what is the best way? I know you're an incredible painter and a muralist and all these things. What do you feel like is the best way to deal with a lot of what happens, A, after the Trump election, and B, as an attorney working with these very tough stories?
Yeah, I think that creating a community, for me personally, I think dealing with trauma is having a space like this, where you have a community that you can reach out to and create a space where you can share and also just celebrate life. And remember, I think part of the beauty of life is eating together, drinking together, having discussions. And I think that when I leave communal spaces like this, I feel re-energized, whether we all agree or not. But I think it's part of my survival mechanism. Yeah. But I also thought one of the most, and also family, and I thought one of the most interesting parts of the book, at least when you were telling me the methodology, was one of the things you did was sit down and interview your mom for several days straight. And, you know, I had just been going through my family history with, you know, refugees on both sides of my family. And just because my parents are starting to have a little bit of, you know, dementia and losing their memories, and I thought, I need to get our family history before it's too late. And hearing you, you know, maybe 20 years younger than me, already having the foresight to do that, to 15. To sit down and interview your mom about her history, and to, like, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I was really thinking about my mom. She's from Chile, and she'd moved back to Chile right about the time that I was starting out as an immigration lawyer, and I realized that as an immigration lawyer, why I got into this was because my mom is an immigrant, and I really wanted to hear her story, because I think, and now I've started to see it as a parent as well, that your kids know you as their parent, but they don't know that you had a life before them. And so Chloe, for example, will know very little about me. And I knew my mother as someone that raised me and all these things about her, but I didn't know her life before I entered it, as much as I should have, I thought. And once I realized that I was doing this work for her in a way, I thought it was really important to go back and listen to that story. And so it was really nothing to do with the book, but once I started writing the book, I figured it was inseparable, that story and the way that I got into immigration law, from my mother's story as well. And so that's kind of how I worked that into the book as well. Yeah. But how did you, what?
She's like, I want to know this dad story before I was born.
Right? How did you deal with some of those stories from the past? I mean, we have this idea now that going on that everyone is an immigrant, and how do you feel about that? Because I was talking with the great Cappy White, who's in the back, and he was saying, you know, it's either everyone's an immigrant or everyone's illegal, and just kind of thought that was a really interesting perspective that he gave, and I don't know how you feel on that debate nowadays.
Yeah, I feel like, to me, like it's so racialized that I feel like that it's, you know, to say that everyone's an immigrant and we're all being oppressed together is inaccurate in today's climate. I really feel like there's an exacting toll on communities of color, the Muslim community, the Latino community, that I know that I actually pulled up all of my family history, and my grandfather was a Russian refugee. He was abandoned in an orphanage at a very young age. But I found his naturalization certificate, and all he had to do was fill out his date of birth, his name, and he was naturalized, right? Do it the right way. He didn't do it the right way. He came here on a boat without permission, and he was naturalized, 4 years later. So I think it's a different phase that I think we're seeing. So I think it does a disservice to the racialization of our communities to say that, we all are immigrants, and we have, of course, the Native Americans are not immigrants, but I think that but I think that it does a disservice to the experience of the community, but also to recognize our own history and our own prejudice and our own hypocrisy when we're judging other people, when many of us have the same family narratives that today's immigrants have.
Absolutely, yeah. And part of the reason, I mean, I had some more poetic ideas for a title in mind, but I think that what's going on right now is so, there's no subterfuge, there's no metaphor, it's out front racist, anti-immigrant language, and so the response that I was trying to achieve with this book and with this title was more of a blunt instrument, to respond to that directly and to say that no human is illegal. We don't need to dehumanize to the point, because as we've seen through the work that we do, one of the biggest things that the Trump administration uses as a deterrent is mistreatment of immigrants, right? We're gonna treat you so bad that you don't want to come to this country. And we see a similar thing in the criminal justice system. Holly and I work with a lot of public defenders as well, and you're defined by your worst act, both in the criminal justice system and in immigration law. And I really wanted to push back on that a little bit with this title. But speaking of public defenders, how have you seen the criminal law and the immigration law? Because Holly's been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I've just started working with public defenders and the consequences of criminal law on immigration law, and it's a fascinating area of law, but something that Holly's an incredible expert on. So do you want to talk about how you've seen criminal law and immigration law mix over the years in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the more powerful work we do is on the criminal defense end of things, is if people do get arrested, which is unfortunate, that we can try and protect their rights insofar as they can't get deported for a crime. So I think part of what we've seen is a lot of cooperation with counties and cities and state governments working with immigration. And we've really seen some of the most powerful advocacy, because it's almost like a funnel, like a, there's like the school to prison pipeline. Well, there's a jail to immigration to deportation pipeline as well. And so, and I think that some people, there's been a real awakening, I think, in the last 5 years about, people do commit crimes, and it's unfortunate, but also that is this the right thing? Is deportation a second punishment? And so I think there's been a real recognition that we do have some unjust criminal laws, and there's been some retraction of that, and the war on drugs. And also, is this the best for the family? Somebody may have done something wrong, but there's a whole panoply of people, maybe larger than this room, when one individual gets deported. You're talking about children that no longer have a father figure or whatnot. So I think that there's been a real movement, at least in the left, because we haven't always had allies on the left on this issue, but there's been a real awakening about the criminal injustice system, is what we call it. So I think it's good. But
I agree that the double charge, I mean, we have this idea under the Constitution that there is no double jeopardy, right? You can't get charged twice for the same crime. But what we see in our work is that an immigrant that has a criminal charge faces that same punishment again under the immigration system, and it's often much worse, because they can be deported to their country that they haven't been to in 30 years, or that is enveloped by this gang violence. And so I think double jeopardy does exist when you're talking about the criminal and immigration context.
Also, I thought one of the things that was interesting in your book was that you talk about the travel ban. And what kind of, and this is about like you on the front lines. So can you give us a little vignette of what it was like to be an immigration lawyer on the front lines when Trump administration announced one of its first executive orders?
Yeah, well, you were as well here in California. I was living in New York City at the time, and so when the ban went into effect, we were there because it was in Washington D.C. It was a Friday at like 5 o'clock, right? Everyone's going home for the weekend, and they signed this ban. Nobody knows what's happening. It was like this silent bomb that went off Saturday morning when all these flights are coming in, and so there was a sign up that attorneys should go to JFK, immigration attorneys should go to JFK, because there was people that had been given refugee status and they were flying into the U.S. and they would lose that status in the air. They would be sent back as soon as they landed in the U.S., and people that had been lawful residents were also landing in the U.S., and they wouldn't be allowed, people from these 7 different countries. So what we did was, I think there was like 20 or 30 of us that signed up in shifts to go to JFK, and we showed up in the morning at 8 in the morning. I left, where'd Chloe go? I left her with Alejandra, and I went to JFK to meet with all these attorneys, and it was incredible because you saw this protest just starting in the parking area and just slowly growing throughout the day. I was there for 10 hours, and the protest was just slowly growing. There was no taxi cabs going through. There was no one getting into the parking garage. And so these people were outside in the cold protesting this, and it was the first week of the presidency. So seeing that solidarity was something that was really powerful. And then from the legal perspective, going inside, working with other immigration lawyers, there's private lawyers from big corporate law firms that had no idea about immigration law, so they were just buying coffee and like giving us all kinds of food and support and all these things. And people were it was a solidarity that was so contagious. And apart from the legal aspect, that was the thing I tried to convey a lot in this book, is the optimism of the Trump election, because it was so negative for so many people in so many communities. But there was a general optimism as well, because it drew together so many communities and so many different advocates and so many people that had been really apathetic in their privilege before the Trump administration. And seeing that at the airport that day, it was life-changing, I think, in my mind. And what was your experience here in California?
I was at home with my sick children, but one of my former students who's here, Elika, called me and said there's an Iranian, I think it was grandparents, who were getting to be deported summarily. And so it was kind of a powerful moment for me, because students don't have to work on the weekends. I'm not that draconian, I think. And I just sent out an email just into the night, and I also sent it to some alums, and I think Jeff Mendelman came through, and all of a sudden I was sitting in my desk with my sick children, and my husband was out of town, and all of a sudden, all of these students showed up at the door of the clinic building and said, "What do you need, boss?" And they just sat down and started typing up habeas petitions. So I want to echo what you said. It was just sort of, during these horrific times, there was this really beautiful sort of solidarity. And, we reached out to, I think, Claire White and Jeff. We were like, is the federal court even open? Can somebody get a live person in the federal court? So there's this really, granular things of we can't get a live person to file this. Get me a live person. And I think you guys did that for us. And then, and then as soon as we got, I think that case resolved itself, we got another call. We heard your case resolved itself. We got another habeas for you, Students were like, okay, back to work. But it was, and also I think what was, for me at least, was when I started typing up the pleadings, the first thing you do is you put in the caption the name of your client, and then you put verses. And I put Donald Trump. I thought, wow, I'm getting ready to sue the President of the United States. And I think, for me, that was really unprecedented. It was also showing you what power the law can have for an individual. So I think...
I put that in the book a little bit about the case in Brooklyn from Judge Donnelly that I eventually stopped the case. And reading the opinion when we were at the airport and everyone started cheering, and reading Judge Donnelly and saying the names of these two Iraqi men that had been translators over in Iraq for the U.S. Army, and going versus Donald Trump and winning, and the judge saying "so ordered." I used some vulgar language in the book to say how that made me feel, but I won't say it here. But it was extremely powerful, right. I think, and I definitely echo what you're saying about that.
Yeah, and so I know that you've also done some work in Spain with refugees and with children, and you've also worked here with our own refugee children population. Can you compare the two? Because I thought that was a very interesting comparison. Yeah,
so part of this book, one of the chapters is working in southern Spain and seeing how the European Union, quote unquote, refugee crisis, which hit its peak in 2015, and we were there in 2017 and 18, how that compared to what was going on in the U.S., because I'd always worked with unaccompanied minors there, and the plan was to see how that works in the European Union as well. And so under Spanish law, it's really fascinating. Under Spanish law, you can't detain anyone that's under 18. They can't be in any jail. And so what they do is they have these residential centers, right? They're actually residential centers. We call them that here in the U.S., and it's just a euphemism, right? They're just polishing a turd, right? But in Spain, it's actually a halfway home. And so they can go in and out as they please. They can eat. They go to school. They do all these things that is so different than what we do here in the U.S. We completely criminalize kids that are under 18, and everything we know about the psychology of young people growing up is that detention is the worst thing for them. And to see in Spain that they I mean, it's probably not the best model because these kids are 16, 17 years old and they're kind of given free rein to go in and out of these centers, and there's some issues that come about with that. There's human trafficking issues, the kids sort of disappear sometimes, and that's really problematic. But to see that under the law you can't be jailed and then come back here and see that kids are not only jailed, they're jailed for a year, 2 years, they're given psychotropic meds without their parents' consent, they're denied water, they're getting pepper sprayed, they're getting beaten up by guards, and they haven't committed any crime, right? They've just come here without their parents. And supposedly that designation, unaccompanied alien child, the UAC, it's supposed to have these certain protections under immigration law, and here in the US it's just a joke what's happening to them. So seeing that in Spain was really, really fascinating. And then one of the things that's also was fascinating in Spain, we'll get to the wall idea, right? In Spain there's this small autonomous city called Melilla, which is on the North African coast across the Mediterranean. It's right on the edge of Morocco. It's like a mollusk right on the edge of Morocco. And it has this 7-mile border with Morocco. And it's this 20-foot high. There's 3 fences. So they're 20 feet high and they're topped with concertina wire. And it's only 7 miles. And even in that short space, they can't keep people out, right? People still get into Spain. And so we're talking about building a 2,000-mile wall, and it doesn't even work in 7 miles. And seeing that in Spain was really powerful to come home. This was obviously before Trump proposed the wall. I mean, he'd talk about build that wall during the campaign, but to see that, how it doesn't work, was really, really powerful. And so now that we've gotten to the wall idea, what do you think of this, what's going on now with the wall, the shutdown? Do you think it's something how do you feel about it in general?
Well, I have the fortune to have represented a lot of immigrants.
Yeah, you've
and
been along the border too.
I used to work along the border, and I would say the vast majority of them were not, most of them came through tunnels or even sewn into car seats, or came, the way, it's, presenting themselves at a point of inspection. So it's interesting, this whole idea, and some of my clients have had a ladder and gone over the wall. So I feel like it's such an epic waste, and I think even when I've worked on the border and spoke with Border Patrol, even in those years, there was pretty much a consensus that this is in no way a deterrent, in no way an effective mechanism. And the technology on the border, as I'm sure you know, is so great. I mean, just the sensory technology that they have is at a level that the wall is like sort of just, it's a symbol. It's a political symbol, and there's a lot of posturing going on, and the sad part is just an economic, just sheer economic waste. I read somewhere, and I don't even know if it's true, is that, we could provide clean water to the world for 3 years with the cost of the wall. And I thought, what a great legacy that would be for any president. Instead of building something that has absolutely, conceded even by the Border Patrol, has no effective deterrence and migration. So, obviously, I think it's just a political symbol, and here we are, all held hostage to his symbol.
I want to talk more about, because one of the sections in the book is in this 2 weeks, I went down to the border and worked at a detention center with mothers and children there. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the interior, what we do here in immigration courts, and the border immigration law, because they're vastly, vastly different. And a lot of people just think, what goes along the border, people just cross the border and they're eventually in deportation proceedings. No, what goes along the border is some really harrowing stuff, and you've had a lot more experience than me in that. And can you enlighten us a little bit about what the border is like?
Yeah, I think it's interesting working on the border is because you're primarily working people who just crossed into the United States. And you could, so I ran a program where we met with everybody that just crossed within all the children and all the adults within a day or two of their arrival. And so, I would meet with, 40 to 50 people a day for 6 years, which was not the best mental health exercise. But, it was really, again, it's depressing, but it's also very inspiring because it's people who survived. And, what we also forget is that we have the vertical border on the United States, but there's also, the immigrants also call it the vertical border, which is Mexico. I mean, getting through Mexico is an enormous effort. A lot of the kids with whom I worked were Chinese, and coming, and also from India, who had taken in $70,000 or $80,000 in debt to get to the United States, and were, going to have to pay it back through indentured servitude. when they got into the United States. So I represented not only, I mean, I think that we often think of Mexicans and Central Americans, but in the times that I worked on the border, there was a pretty heavy migration of Chinese and Indian people from Sri Lanka as well. I think the big difference for me was just that there was more of a cloak of invisibility. Really, nobody knew what was happening, right? There was a little level more of impunity. And I remember leaving the children's detention facilities where you'd see kids, sometimes they were strapped in chairs, they were shackled, they were in solitary confinement, there was 20 to a cell, and sometimes I would wonder, is anybody awake in this country? And this was, 20 years ago. But really, I feel like if Trump's done nothing else, he's awakened in us. Many of us already had that awakening, but there's been more of a collective awakening to, I think, the immigration experience and the human rights violations. And so I feel like there's been a little bit of a lid lifted off of the border, and people are peering into it now. Journalists, human rights advocates, civil rights lawyers. I never feel like when I leave a detention center, no one knows what's going on anymore. I mean, we probably get 20 calls a week from journalists.
Yeah.
So that's
I think that's a fascinating perspective because the history of immigration law is so much different than we think it is, and I try and touch on some of that in the book, but I mean, that's a whole nother book. That's an encyclopedia of the various immigration laws we've gone through. But we tend to think that things are the worst they've ever been now, or they've never been like this. But your experience along the border is that kids have always been detained, kids have always been mistreated, families have always been detained. It's always been, what can you get away with before somebody files a lawsuit or somebody does something. And the Trump administration is the first administration that's saying, well, we're going to do it out in the open. We don't care what anyone thinks about us. There's no shaming us into it. When before it was like when you expose these nightmares through a lawsuit, through journalists, through whatever, people would jump back and say, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. But now under the Trump administration, it's sort of passing as the new normal, and fighting against that every day is very tiring as well. I imagine from you that's seen this for 20 years, and for me that's only been in this 4 or 5 years, it gets very tiring to fight against that sort of terribleness.
Yeah. So I'm a mom and you're a dad, and I think one of the things that's interesting is how do we balance this world with raising our own children, and I thought your book sort of had a little bit of an illustration of that. I remember when I was pregnant being inside of detention centers, and every time something unjust would happen, my kid would kick me, and I'd be like, yeah, I know. I'm going to take care of that. Just calm down in there. So it's like you have this other world of of raising kids. And, even one day I was driving my kid to, Little League. I ran from the jail where there's like 20 kids, and they're all in solitary, and they're all banging on their cells, like freedom in Spanish. And, I pick up my kid, and he's like, Mom, what is this notebook? What does this say? This kid's slitting his wrist? And I was like grabbing the notebook. I mean, so, and then you have to kind of sit down with your kids and debrief them about, the horrors.
Yeah.
And so, like, how do you raise kids and raise hell at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm lucky in a sense that we're working with teenagers and people, and my daughters are both very, very young, and so I don't have the experience where I see my kids in the people that are detained, not yet at least. And I know that you have 2 teenage boys, so that must be very difficult to see perhaps, this could be your child in another world. And I think that's very difficult. I don't equate my daughter to that yet, but someday down the road I might. But I think, yeah, it's very difficult to separate, because if I know very little about parenting, so far, I'm trying to figure it out as I go. But
You don't know who your daughter is.
Right? Yeah, oh my God. The one thing I do know is you need a lot of patience, and if there's anything that tests your patience, it's immigration law. And so to run out of patience every day, and at the end of the day have to go home to a daughter that's crying about something, or I shouldn't say that, she's a great kid, but there's always something going on at the end of the day that you need that extra patience, and I think to not bring that home is really difficult. And one of the parts in the book I talk about is when I was working with mothers and children and along the border, and I had to leave my wife Alejandra and Chloe when she was a newborn in New York alone, and then I would see her every day in those mothers and those children that I was working with, and that was a very difficult experience to not. It stuck with me, and it's still stuck with me, and that's part of the reason I wrote the book. And I don't have a good answer to how you separate it. We just kind of grin and bear it, I guess. And we write about it. And I think that's a lot of what has helped me to get through this. is to write about it and to make sense of it and what's going on. And obviously, my wife is this incredible woman that's been so supportive of this work about moving all over the place. And when I come home and it's just been the worst day and you just want to sit down and cry, she's been very great to me. And I know Joel, your husband, has done the same for you.
Yeah. Do people have questions too, or do we want to open it up?
Yeah, I think we should
yeah.
start going on that.
Gentleman back
Yeah.
there, the blue shirt.
The
Yeah.
blue shirt. Yeah.
I think we have like 15 minutes.
That's awesome. Good job.
Is that okay? Open question.
Jan? Yes.
I just wanted to say, before my question, I'm sorry, but I have to say this, that my older son is a prosecutor in Los Angeles, and he's currently working in the juvenile court downtown. And he swears to me that enlightenment has hit the office in LA, and that they try very hard to incarcerate as few people as possible.
Interesting.
That they try to avoid bringing certain kinds of charges that would endanger the many children they deal with who are, quote, illegal, end quote. And they avoid asking about it or dealing with it as an issue. So I'm not saying this in defense of all prosecutors and all prosecutors' offices in the country, but he's been very pleased with the direction that they're going in there. And it makes him feel much better because he actually feels as if he's part of the helping rather than the harming. But my question is this. Last night I went to a talk at the California Historical Society about the legal history involving Chinese immigration to the United States. And for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1888, the earlier Act of 83, the complicated history of Supreme Court decisions about that. I'm wondering what you can look to in our legal past, especially decisions as high as the Supreme Court, that might help you in the work you do.
Wow, that was a great question, very informed, yeah. And I'm glad, a lot of the prosecutors we've worked with in California have also been, thanks to the incredible work of ILRC and other places, there's lots of prosecutors that have sort of realized their legal duty to recognize the immigration consequences of criminal offenses. So I'm very glad that your son feels that way as well. As far as immigration history, I think a lot of what the constitutional protections that apply to people that are non-citizens, a lot of those cases are still from the early 20th century. And so if we think back to the mindset of the United States at that point in the history, we can imagine what a lot of those decisions were like. And so having to use those decisions now there's not a lot of positive to be used from that. I think the more, and Holly she's been doing federal litigation a lot more than I have, but I think the positive to look forward now is what we can do in the future, not from the past, but coming up with new, novel, creative theories to challenge what's going on now, as opposed to looking to the past, because I don't think the past treatment of immigrants in this country is anything to really be proud of.
Yeah, I think
That's not the answer I wanted.
I think it's also important to look at the history of resistance movements in communities. And I thought one of the more interesting things I learned, because I was curious, why do we have a Northern California ACLU and a Southern California ACLU? And so I read up on the history. And part of it was that the ACLU National didn't want to challenge Japanese internment, the level. And so they branched off to make their own ACLU. So I think it's really important also to recognize there are groups within times of much needed resistance that play into administrations and other groups don't. And I think that that's also what's really fascinating to me, is how deep we can stand our line without bending, because it's scary, right? To sue the president, to know that I just found out today that some interesting things about, they've been monitoring a colleague, and it's scary times, right? And I think there's a tendency to want to be complicit and to move, in a way that's not going to jolt the administration or draw attention to yourself. So I think not only is there the history of our laws of oppression, but there's also how have we as advocates and people resisted that? Not just lawyers, right? But our community members and our legal organizations. So I think it's important to remember that history so that we don't also repeat the complicity.
I came here, I was very interested in the title of your book, and I recently heard an interview on NPR's Fresh Air with an author whose name is Tom Gelton. Do you know that person? His book is called A Nation of Nations.
A Nation of
and
Nations.
A Nation of Nations. And I've not read the book. I've only heard this interview that was on Fresh Air on NPR radio about 2 weeks ago. And one of the things he said struck me, and I wondered whether this has come up in your work or in your classes with students, working with students. He talked about how, he talked about the history of changes in immigration law in the United States. He talked about how the current political framework has reframed the concept of what an immigrant is, and that early in our history as a country, our concept of people coming to settle here, they were called settlers. They were not called immigrants. And now we call them immigrants. And in the change of that also a process of dehumanization. And it struck me as a very insightful idea. What Trump has done is labeled people, demonized them, called them rapists and murderers and so forth, and dehumanized them.
Yeah.
And instead, it seems to me, what needs to be done in part, in counter to that, is again and again to humanize the people. They are coming to settle here, and they are coming to contribute to the country to whatever the level of their ability is and training and so forth at that point in time. And so I just wonder whether this is something that you've heard discussed, or whether it's something, especially with students and within the legal profession, that can be brought more to the surface. It seemed to me like a terrific, insightful idea.
I agree. I'd go beyond even settlers. I mean, if we go through our history, we have discoverers, pilgrims, we call them, the Davy Crockett's in Texas, the Lewis and Clark coming out into Oregon, the pilgrims that came first to the U.S. I mean, I think it goes beyond settlers, what we used to call immigrants and what we call now illegal aliens. And that was again part of the reason that we ended up choosing this title, was because that dehumanization is exactly right. I mean, we see it throughout history, and it's become this repetitive sort of mantra, the illegals, illegal, as if every other aspect of you is subsumed by this, and you become your worst act, or you become something that you did out of desperation. Just like, someone that stole food stamps so they could feed their child, they're all of a sudden a criminal now, instead of just a human being that was desperate and that committed a criminal act. And I think that's been pushed over into immigration law. It started, I would say, when they created the Department of Homeland Security in 2001, and we started equating immigrants with terrorists, and every immigrant that came could have been a terrorist, and it became a safety issue. And once we got past that, it became gang members or drug dealers. And so it was, again, the safety. They were challenging our safety. And when someone challenges our safety, we can dehumanize them to the point that we can do these horrible things to them. And so they become illegal, and then it doesn't matter what we do to them.
Yeah, and I think it's even, a step further, is that it's not even just demonizing, but we've criminalized them. We actually have criminalized them. And we have the biggest prison system in the world, and the fastest growing prison population are immigrants. We have a record high of 14,000 children in immigration prisons. 14,000 children, and 40,000 adults. So, and in the criminal justice system, or injustice system, we're seeing people being prosecuted for entering the country, in the way that the Trump administration doesn't like, and being ineligible for political asylum if they cross the border. Yeah. So I think it's the demonization, but then there's this yoke around the neck of the individuals being put into solitary confinement. And I think people think of detention centers where people are as something less than prison, but it's exactly like a prison. I've been in like 35 to 40 different prisons, and there's no difference in what immigrants face.
I agree.
So you've addressed Trump's desire to build the wall and also his lack of discretion about what's happening on the borders with the detention centers, and especially with the separation of the children. I was wondering if there are any other fundamental differences between the Trump administration and the Obama administration, or if it's possible that aside from the lack of discretion, the desire for the wall, they're not as different as maybe we'd like to think they are on immigration?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you. I think that it's been steadily building to this moment. I think it wasn't just President Obama, it was President Clinton that signed the 1996 immigration law, which was the last change we've had to immigration law, which was created sort of this incredibly draconian immigration law that we work with now. And then during the Bush years, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the building of 650 miles of border wall. I mean, it's sort of built to this. And President Obama, supposedly the argument was that he was doing all this enforcement, deporting 3 million people to bring the Republicans to the table and to negotiate on immigration reform. But as I write about in the book, even during his last 6 months in office, he was still conducting mass immigration raids. And so to think that this was some sort of negotiation ploy just doesn't hit the mark at all. And when I think of immigration law through the years, I feel like through the successive administrations, what they've done is they've left a loaded gun on the table of the in the Oval Office, and President Trump is the person that's grabbed onto that gun, and I think we've seen the repercussions of that.
Coming your way.
So cute.
So if you were Nancy Pelosi and
Oh,
President
I wish,
Trump,
right? I wish.
You wish you were Nancy. Better get a suit on.
tell me how would you try and fix the immigration system?
Yeah. I think that's a question that we get a lot, and I think it starts with two things. First off, not thinking of it as an immigration system, right? We're talking about human movement. It's no coincidence that immigration law, the law that it has the most in common with is tax law, right? It's statutorily based, and the similarities are incredible when you look at the INS, no, what's it called? The tax law people? IRS.
We're on shutdown. Our brains are on shutdown.
They're shut down. Yeah.
We don't know taxes.
So what the IRS does and the laws that they use is very similar to DHS and the laws that they use. It's very, very similar. And when you think of a system, you think of tax law, right? It's a system for adding, subtracting, taking away money. And that's what immigration law is. It's adding, subtracting, and taking away people. And it's been very similar. And so I think we need to get away from this mindset that this is an immigration system that we need to fix as if it's the car that's broken down and we can just reform it and change it. I think what we need to do, instead of focusing on what the politicians think and what they're going to be doing, is we need to come back to basic humanity in the way we treat people coming to this country and people that are in this country, and start from that point. If we can get back to that point, then I think we can get to the table and start talking about immigration reform. But while we're still talking about people in the way we're talking about them, there's no reason to get into immigration reform.
Question in the front.
What I really want to know is, I'm not a lawyer, but what can I do to go get those kids out of detention on the border? It's breaking my heart. I mean, what can we do? You know, I just want to go raid or something.
All right.
Go, you started on that one, yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look at what happened, in the airports, I mean, I think that having protest is enormous value. Because if you look at part of the requirement of the Constitution that we have to prove, it talks about like the judges, even in like the Miss L, the family separation litigation, they looked at what was happening in the streets. They cited what was happening in the streets. Like, I've been doing federal litigation for 20 years, and most judges are just like, we didn't have a lot of receptivity. Maybe I was in Arizona, and it was a bad forum to litigate in. But I feel like there's a lot more receptivity to what I thought were very creative arguments. And I think that when you have the resistance of the people, then you have some of that reflected in the judiciary. And it's not a perfect world. But I really would just, you may not feel like you're making a difference because you're in a protest and this kid isn't walking out the door as you're chanting, but I think that you are making a difference. And I think that, you're moving the judiciary and your actions are sort of moving the bigger policy. So I wouldn't stop doing that. And I also, you want to help the children. I feel like, just being able to hear their stories and change, because I think somebody mentioned the vocabulary we're using, just really untangling that in your brain and being able to see people as humans. That's a really heavy lift. And then just educating people. My big resolution after Trump became president was to go talk to my people. My I came from rural, white, sort of middle income background, and because that's kind of who I have a duty to educate. And so I feel like those are the individuals that I think need to understand a little bit better about, to disentangle this racist narrative. I think we also have a duty to educate our communities. And for me, my community is probably one of the most, politically in the electorate, important to educate on this issue, or to uneducate.
I think to go along with that, I think that is, instead of like this big thing of getting children out, there's small acts of compassion. I write a little bit about this in the book, but for example, our students have done incredible work with people that want to donate food to detention centers. We've done incredible work to get food into detention centers. When kids are released, they don't have jackets in winter. We get jackets donated to them. One kid survived in detention by being an artist, and so we've had incredible people donate art supplies to him. And just those small, simple acts of compassion, I think, go a long way, instead of just trying to bust kids out, because even we as lawyers haven't been able to do that.
Yeah, we've had NASA scientists donate. We've had rabbis do a crowd raiser for a child and raise $10,000 overnight. I mean, it's the community. When we all come together, I think we can make a powerful difference.
How do I find out about it?
Just email us.
Email us, yeah, sure.
There's an ocean of need.
Yeah.
Also, and you,
And your email is?
We'll give it to you later, yeah, sure. Come
I'm a member now of
Yeah,
the
we're
Mechanics
members.
Institute, so my email's on file.
you can also be in touch with our co-sponsor, Refugee Transitions, and their email and their e-list is on the table there, and they have brochures. They're
And
right
there's
around the corner.
At least 20 other immigrant rights advocates and criminal justice advocates here in this room that you could
They're
also.
incredible students that have been meeting with a lot of people to get that as well, and they've been coordinating that as well.
Question here?
Oh, Nicholas.
Your mother is a Spanish language poet. The love of your life is Spanish.
Yeah.
All these stories you hear, many of the stories you hear every day are in Spanish. What are your obligations and difficulties translating that into English?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. I think that this is, when we think of immigrants, we think of, the Spanish-speaking, because a lot of the people that come to this country are Spanish-speaking, my mother, my wife, and there's a huge duty, I think, as people that are bilingual or people that can speak Spanish, like Holly, like some of our students, and to use that ability to go forward and help people in this area. I don't know if that answered your question. Well, that was a really difficult question. Not yet.
So I've been horrified by the lack of health care for the immigrants on the border, that resulted in the death of a couple of children because people didn't have the understanding of what they were looking at. Do you see anything coming forward that will remedy that in healthcare or immigration reform?
In our case, we're actually working on that right now. We have a call. So we both, and the students as well, work on this settlement agreement called the Flores Settlement Agreement. And we had the fortune to have a special monitor appointed. And we just, and so she's taken it upon herself. She's like an investigatory arm of the court now. And so she flies around the United States to gauge the temperature. And we just found out that she did a surprise visit to Border Patrol to test the temperature in the room, to see if there's adequate medical staffing. Because I think the problem with people coming in to inspect facilities is there's like 3 weeks notice, right? And then, I've gone out to, some of the juvenile detention facilities, and I was like, I was just out here yesterday, and it didn't quite look like this, the floors are scrubbed, the kids are all look happy, And so, I think that there can be a little sort of bamboozlement that could happen when people come in to inspect, whether it's senators, whether it's, human rights individuals. But what's nice about her is that she's kind of going in without any notice and inspecting the Customs Border Patrol. Will that fix it? I don't know, right? But there's a level of accountability that's coming from the judicial branch to say, I'm here to inspect, I'm part of the arm of the court, I want to see all the kids, I want to see their records, I want to see the staffing, and she showed up at midnight. So we're hoping, it may not be a perfect solution, right? It's there's a lot of territory to cover, right, in the United States. But we're hoping that will make change, and if it doesn't, then we have other plans, So, but the kid's death was on Christmas Eve. Was I think it struck us all in a really powerful way, and we've asked her to investigate that as well in the El Paso Border Patrol sector. So we'll keep you posted. But I agree, it's horrific, and we need accountability, and that's, I think, one step in the right direction.
And I want to add to that, the Border Patrol, before the creation of Department of Homeland Security, what they used to do was when they found someone in the desert that was ill, they would take them to a hospital immediately, and they wouldn't fingerprint them. They wouldn't get this whole idea of you need to be detained immediately. They would take care of their medical needs first, and then if they needed to be detained, they would be detained. But now that's sort of changed. It's first, let's take you to detention, let's put you in jail in the Alera, in these really cold rooms, and then let's see what's wrong with you. And that change since around 2002 has been really, really dramatic and very difficult.
As your students, we have a great privilege to be learning from you and working with you. And I think something that I've been wanting to know is what is your advice for us as we're entering as young advocates into this type of law, and what is the fire that keeps you going?
Well, I think you've
Well,
been
you
doing it a
guys
lot
are the
longer.
fire that keeps me going.
Yeah.
It's like I call my students my eternal fountain of youth, because every time you're sort of feeling, well, every
It's
day
like
I'm
Dorian
feeling
Gray.
older and older, which is a good thing, right? It's better than the alternative. It's like your students have that fresh outrage, because I think sometimes you start to sort of do the intake with a kid, and it's the 50th kid that's told you about the freezer cell and being chained to a wall, and but then the students come in and they're like, oh my God, they're like, we need justice now, the Suyapa and the Karen and the Emily's and the Camilas, and and Elizabeth was here somewhere. There she is. So I think that really, and also just I think as I've raised children and seen children detained, and I sort of understand when my kids were 2 and I saw the 2-year-old and I see the 14 and the 15-year-old, I understand where they are, and I understand much deeper level how unjust it is. And I think before I had kids, I got it, but now I really get it. And so it's really, I think, hard. I think that keeps my fire going, is to see my kids, and then to see the mirror image of my child in a cell, I think really makes me want to never sleep again and just get everybody out. But I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think having really, really young kids, I think there's a certain responsibility of the world you want them to grow up in, and so I don't see my kids in the people I work with yet, luckily, but I think I do see the world I want them to live in, or I understand the world I want them to live in, and I think fighting for that is really powerful. And then also you students as well has been really, really re-energizing working with you, and then I think colleagues too. You have to find like Holly and some of these other advocates here in the room tonight that really support each other. I think it's find your group and rely on them, because you're going to be doing it together for a long time. So.
Just a hard coming.
And Suyapa's from Honduras.
Yeah.
She's the expert.
First, I want to say thank you, because as an immigrant myself, no illegal humans, essentially. I want to say thank you. You have been part of my growing as a professional here. I want to say it aloud that I really feel like everyone in the clinic, especially all the professors, are having have this connection and help me to grow as a professional. And as an immigrant, honestly, it's very difficult. I appreciate the fact that you say at the beginning that every immigrant has something to give to this country. And I remember that when Donald Trump says something about immigrants are people who's coming and taking everything, I thought about, well, who I am, you know? And I have been asking me the questions, who I am in this country.
Yeah.
So I wonder, what do you think about who we as a professional immigrants are in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that a lot growing up because that's a question my mother asked herself all the time. She was someone that came here fleeing the military coup in Chile, and she came here lawfully, and she worked at a Mexican restaurant for $1 an hour as her first job, and eventually she got a PhD, and she was a professional, but it was always the same question, where are you from? Where are you from? As if the brown skin and the accent never went away. And she was always looking for her place, and until she moved back to Chile, you know. And so that's a question I've always grappled with, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to tackle it in the book. And I'm sorry it's still going on now, and that you feel that way.
You want to respond? Holly, did you want to respond? Or?
Oh, about what keeps me going? I think,
Oh, the SUYAPA?
Oh, thank you. I don't know what to say. But our students are great. They actually are really the investigatory arm of the clinic, too. They've been out to the different detention facilities, and SUYAPA had the, you know, it's great to see students who, you know, are bilingual and native speakers because, you know, the clients can really connect with them, especially when, I think SUYAPA walked in one day and he's like, where are you from in Tegucigalpa? I'm from here, and I'm from here. Oh my God, we like live next door to each other. And it was like, I could be a lawyer for another 20 years and I would never have that kind of a connection with a child, right? And so, you know, it's really, it's like what we need more of is the advocates that, you know, the communities can see themselves in. And I think there's a place for everybody, but there's a real beauty to that connection. And so she's been a, you know, enormous asset, as well as Karen and Emily, and everybody has been an asset to the cases. But so it's, you know, I think that also just, you know, you writing this book as a Latino with your own recent, you know, family immigration experience, I think is really important so that we get more advocates that will step into this field.
Question in the back?
Hello. So I'm an undergrad student at SF State. I'm not sure if you remember, but I actually visited UC Davis last week.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we visited
Hopefully
we
you
visited
liked
the
it.
immigration
Yeah.
clinic as part
She's
of
like, they were
Immigrants
awesome.
Rising, and then you invited us here, so thank you.
Thank you for coming.
I really like the title of the book. I think that's such a fundamental. I've seen it to be such a fundamental statement in the movement that's led, particularly by undocumented youth, right? And those same folks in that movement are, you know, advocate for the abolishment of ICE and Border Patrol and also borders. As I know the conversation right now, as we have like the government shut down, I feel like we're kind of far from that. But to me, that statement that no human being is illegal is inherently tied to the way that we view we view borders. So I wanted to ask, like, do you see a need for how this nation views or even uses borders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's, in a lot of places, the border is just rushing water or a line in the sand, and so it's things that people have drawn. If we look back on World War II, the history of World War II, they pretty much redrew Africa. You know, just thought, oh, I'll draw a line here, and I think borders have always been political and man-made, and they've been used to demonize the others and create this idea of home, that this is our home and this border separates. It's like the white picket fence expanded across 2,000 miles. And no, I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there's a colonial history to most borders that delegitimizes them in my mind. So I have pretty strong feelings about borders myself, probably similar to your own. And it's not just in the United States, right? It's all over the world.
Yeah.
At least we're not going through Brexit.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I want to bring it also a little back home. If you can give us some view of what's happening in, Noma, in Sonoma and Napa and the UC Davis area with the immigrant workers, and how things are being affected there by the various border issues. And also just some examples of something, positive things that are happening with your work with the clinic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very lucky to live in a heavily agricultural area, and I think throughout history, landowners have usually been more conservative. They don't want to get rid of their land. They don't want to do this. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that owns land who grows things that is anti-immigration, especially in California, because that's their workforce. There's no U.S. citizen that you will find that will work 15 hours a day in the 120-degree heat picking strawberries for $6 an hour. It just won't happen, and that's what we eat. That's what gets to our grocery store, and I think that's important to consider when we're talking about this immigration debate as well, as you're talking about the workforce.
Yeah, and we had a victory a few weeks ago. One of our students argued a case in the High Circuit Court, and they won, and we were able to protect an informant who was serving as an informant for the federal government, and then they turned around after she was done and tried to deport her. She's a grandmother, and she lives here locally, and so we fought for her, but that was a victory. I think you asked what are some of our victories. And what's nice about our victories is the case has been going on for 12 years, so I think we counted somewhere over 30 students that have worked on the case. I don't know if any of them are in this room, but anyway, so it's nice to see those victories. They're few, but when you get them, I think during times of oppression we have to cry, but we also have to celebrate our victories 3 times as hard, because it sort of gives us a lifeline too.
Well, I want to say bravo for your victories and many more. Thank you, advocates, for being in this field and just being brave and getting out there and fighting for human rights and justice. And we also encourage you to come up, buy a book, have it signed, come and talk to our guests. Ooh, there it goes. Wow. And then afterwards, we'll give you a tour of the library. So come on up. Mm.